So I have some passages of Confucianism picked out, and I thought it'd be interesting for you to explain what these passages mean.
Okay.
All right. So the first passage says this: The way lies in what is near, but people seek it in what is distant. One's task lies in what is easy, but people seek it in what is difficult. If everyone would treat their kin as kin and their elders as elders, the world would be at peace. All right, what does that mean?
Good question. That's a very famous passage from the Analects. And I mean, there's multiple components to it, right? So I like this one part, the initial part where in the Analects, so what's going on there is Confucius seems to be saying a lot of people look outward, like far away in a distant, but there's all kinds of things that we can do, at a more local level. So I think this is actually a kind of important point today where, and maybe like a kind of criticism of certain people who are more kind of progressive minded because they tend to emphasize like the global, right, like poverty or the global like injustices, like going off at a distant country. And but then like I sometimes wonder like, but there's problems where you are, right, in your community, in your city. There's homeless people, there's people who need help. And so I do think that there's something bad if so, and there are people like this, and maybe we're all guilty of it in some ways, and where we kind of like, talk a big talk about helping at a global level, but we don't really do enough for the people who are near to us, right? Maybe we treat our own family members, or even like people within our own neighbors like crap. But then we talk this big game about justice, right? And I think Confucius here might be criticizing something like that kind of attitude instead of sort of working maybe on yourself also, or working to improve at a more local level where you can make more improvements. Sometimes people are too outwardly focused. That might be part of it. I think he thinks that really virtue and goodness is built up by treating people well that you see on a day-to-day basis. That if you think you can just be virtuous because all you do is read about injustices in another country, you're not really doing much. That's not what we might call the hard work. The hard work is developing the virtues, living well on a day-to-day basis, cultivating generosity, and courage, and doing what's right, every day instead of just kind of outwardly focused. I think something like that seems to be part of what he's saying, and he's saying you have ample opportunities here to treat others as like your own family, even strangers, right? And so you can really do quite a bit to cultivate the self where you are. I think that might be just part of the practical advice there.
So when it says the way, is that referring to the way to live a good life?
Yeah. So the way, or the Tao, right? That's kind of this important Chinese concept. Usually means translated as something like path or the way, and you find this throughout the Chinese traditions. So the way is really the proper path, the proper the proper way of living well. And so that's the kind of that is how you should live, carry out your life. That's basically what he's referring to there.
All right, let's do another passage. The master said, eating plain foods and drinking water, having only your bent arm as a pillow. Certainly there is joy to be found in this. Wealth and eminence attained improperly concern me no more than the floating clouds.
Great. So it's interesting. One of the things I think you find throughout not only in this important classical Chinese text, but throughout even the ancient Greek traditions or the Western traditions, is that the wise people seem to think that human beings tend to place way too much weight on external goods, let's call them, right? Wealth, prosperity, rather than internal goods of the soul, we might call them, having to do with virtue, perhaps, maybe knowledge, development of one's mind, right? So I think Confucius here is saying, look, the deepest joy is to be found in living well, cultivating the virtues, and being a good person. And if you try to gain power and wealth improperly by acting viciously or lying or cheating or acting badly, those really are have very little value. Yes, we could see that you can use the money to then buy all kinds of stuff that's shiny and good, But what's shiny and good and very attractive, maybe initially, isn't really what he thinks are the most important goods. So I really feel like a lot of these wise philosophers, like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Confucius, or Mencius, these thinkers all recognize that there's a kind of hierarchy of goods. Yes, actually, and Confucius himself doesn't think wealth is inherently bad. He doesn't say that. He thinks it has a role to play, and other external goods also have a role to play as well. But the most important good always for a lot of these thinkers tend to be something like virtue, moral goodness, character, knowledge. And it's interesting, yeah, why they think that. I mean, I tend to agree with them. I don't know what arguments there are exactly like that we can offer. A lot of people probably be like, yeah, well, that's just kind of, highfalutin thought, you're living in an ivory castle. But I think all these thinkers were right. There's something more deep, more profound about these goods of the soul. Now, exactly how to argue for that, I'm not sure. It just has to do with conception of what the good is, what living well is. Yeah, do you have any thoughts about that, Jason, about this idea of hierarchy of goods, which I do think is very important?
I'm partial to this hierarchy, right? Like, I don't think wealth is as important as being a good person. But that's because, like, what we're talking about is morality, right? We are talking about ethics here. So it just seems quite obvious to me that wealth would be something like secondary, like it seems like you could be a perfectly ethical person and be poor at the same time, right? Whereas you can't be poor, you can't be a good person while also like doing all these bad immoral things, which comes, from your character. So I mean that makes perfect sense to me. But if
I
they're
think
if they're
yeah.
also talking about something different, right? So maybe like because
Mhm.
I'm one of those philosophers who make a distinction between like ethics, like what's morally good and what's prudentially good, right? I can
Mhm.
see how wealth is instrumentally good for me. So in that sense, I would place value on it, but I don't think it has anything to do with me being a good person, right? It can enable me to exercise, the virtue of charity, right? But that's pretty much it.
Mhm. Yeah, it's so also the other thing that I don't think I noted is a lot of these classical Confucians, they also talk about joy and how joy is connected to living well, being a morally good person, acting virtuously. So they think that there's a certain distinctive kind of profound pleasure attached to being a good person and doing what's right. Whereas I think like sometimes in the modern world, the two are kind of pitted against each other, right? So there's like the right thing to do, and that often requires tremendous sacrifice, right, of your self-interest or something like that. Whereas I think they thought, yes, maybe you have to sometimes sacrifice, some wealth or fame or power to be a good person. But being a good person itself already carries also a certain distinctive and what they would deem to be even a higher form of joy. And I think they think that came out of the fact that human beings by nature we're kind of moral animals. We deeply want to see ourselves as also good. So if we think of ourselves as living badly, being cruel, vicious, that often is kind of a painful thing. And in fact, here's evidence of that. I mean, even if when you think of we don't have to name names, but even when you think of people who are pretty bad, right, that we can think about in contemporary times, they never think of themselves really, or at least they don't really say it like that, right? They try to defend themselves. They say, no, I'm not a bad person. I'm doing this for good reasons. No one really just tends to think, oh, yeah, no, I really am a piece of crap. Like, that's not usually how the story goes because it's extraordinarily painful to think of yourself as a bad human being. And so I think the Confucians are also latching onto a deep part of our moral psychology, which is, yeah, we have desires for shiny objects, for power, for pleasure, but we also have this deep desire to be morally good and to see ourselves as good in some way. Because that's also bound up with, I think, self-respect, and not respecting yourself seems like a very bad thing for our psychic harmony. So I think that's also another thing that they're getting at there.
Cool. All right, let's do one more. All right, here is the passage. A young person who is filial and respectful of his elders rarely becomes the kind of person who is inclined to defy his superiors. Once the roots are firmly established, the way will grow. Might we not say that filial piety and respect for elders constitute the root of goodness?
Yeah. So again, I think this comes back to this idea that, well, first of all, I think when we grow up, right, we grew up usually in a family, right, with parents, or if one's adopted, other caretakers. But when you're young, you don't have a well-formed identity, you don't have a real understanding of ethics or morality. So the way we learn morality and also our identity and what's right or wrong, good or bad, is by through our parents usually, right? And so I think the Confucians thought when children start early and get into habit of being able to follow what they deem to be morally good or bad. I mean, and when you're young, you just think what your parents say is right. And as you get older, you do try, you do develop some independence and understanding to the point where you could disagree with your parents and they could be wrong. But when you're young, I think the Confucians thought it's important to create a certain mindset where, being able to follow what you deem to be good, which again, in the early stages are what your parents say, is extremely important. Cultivating that habit, that disposition is very, very important. And so your sense of morality grows from those early experiences in childhood. They're sort of the building blocks of your moral identity. And so I think that they thought those early years are formidable, powerful, enduring. And so when you grow up as kind of respectful children, respectful towards your parents, the laws, the rules, then you have a much higher chance of also being a good citizen, perhaps being a good member of the community, being conscientious, and so on. So I think I think they're trying to get at what they perceive to be an important part of the way psychologically we develop as human beings. I think that's part of the message there.